Hi there, my name is Matti Sulanto. I'm a photographer based in Helsinki, Finland. In this video I'm going to explain you the manual exposure, what it is, how to use it and why to use it. My channel just reached 1000 subscribers and I'd like to thank you and thank everybody for supporting me on this one. And it feels really good to continue from here. And if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and click the bell also so you get a notification every time I publish a new video. Today's topic is the manual exposure in photography. But let's first establish what is the exposure. Well, the exposure is the amount of light that enters the camera and hits the sensor at the time I press the shutter. But there has to be a way to control the amount of light that enters the camera. Otherwise, our exposures or our images would be most of the time too bright or too dark, because the light that surrounds us, the ambient light, is changing all the time. Right now it's a cloudy winter day and it's pretty low light compared to a sunny summer day, for example. Have you ever used manual exposure? And if you have, in what kind of situations are you using it? Please let me know in the comments below. How do you control the exposure then? Well, we have three controls in our cameras. The controls or the values that you can use to actually control the amount of light that enters the camera are the shutter speed and the aperture or the f-stop. And then there's the ISO control that controls the brightness of the image the same way as the shutter speed and aperture, but it does not affect the amount of light that enters the camera. Why would you use manual exposure then? Most of the time, automatic exposure does a pretty good job, but there are some situations where manual exposure is much better. And I think the main benefit of manual exposure is that the exposure values do not change until you change them. Even if you turn your camera off and back on again, the same values are still there. And if the lighting conditions stay the same, like on a cloudy day like this, your exposures will be constant, the brightness of your images will be constant, and you can apply the same adjustments to all of your images, and that saves a lot of time in post. The other benefit of manual exposure is that you can choose the exposure values that you like. Well, almost the values you like anyway. There's a common misunderstanding that in manual exposure you can choose any combination of the shutter speed, aperture or the ISO. But that would be a bit too good. It doesn't work quite that way. I've heard people say that, how is this possible? I'm using manual exposure, but still my picture turns out to be too bright or too dark. All those values, the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO, they are connected. But you can still prioritize the value that is the most important at your current shooting situation. But how do you set the correct exposure then? Every camera has an indicator that tells you when the exposure is correct, and that's called a light meter. The minus sign is too dark and the plus sign means too bright, and at the 0 the exposure is correct. And if you're using a modern camera with an electronic viewfinder, you can also eyeball the viewfinder or the image on the rear display to confirm that the light meter is telling you the right thing. And then there's also the histogram that you can use to evaluate your exposure, and that's actually a pretty good way to evaluate the exposure. My good friend Peter Fusgod has a great video about that. Please take a look, I'll put a link below. Okay, I found this really cool shower here because actually, believe it or not, this is a beach in summertime. So I wanted to take a picture of the shower head or whatever you call it with a very shallow depth of field. So I'm going to select f number 2 and then I will select my shutter speed to match that so that I'll get the exposure that looks good. F2, and my shutter speed is 1/320th of a second and ISO 100. Now there's an interesting looking scene back there. I'm gonna go there and take a landscape photo. And there I want to have as much depth of field as possible. So I'm gonna start by selecting aperture f11, and that'll give me plenty of depth of field. And then I will choose the shutter speed that matches that. But because it's relatively low light here, my shutter speed is going to be pretty long, so I'm going to have to raise the ISO to up to 400, and then I will get the shutter speed that will be good for handheld shooting. As you can see here, my light meter tells me that the image is too bright. It shows me +1. But that's because the white snow is fooling the light meter. But still, if you look at the image itself, it looks like perfect exposure. So in every situation the light meter is not right, and that's why it's important to verify the exposure by either looking at the viewfinder image or the histogram or something else. Even though manual exposure offers some benefits in some situations, it's no way any more professional or any better than any of the automatic exposure modes. There's a place for the automatic exposures or a situation, and there's another situation for manual exposure. But understanding manual exposure will help you to understand how the camera works and how automatic exposure works, and it may help you also to analyze your own pictures afterwards. I fully understand that this is not a complete guide to manual exposure. That would take too long to make. It would be a much longer video. But I still hope you found this useful, and I thank you for watching again, and I'll see you next time. And now it's so cold, I'm freezing, I have to go inside and get warm.